There we go. All right, so now I will go ahead and introduce our speaker. Cecilia Polizzi is a human rights lawyer, executive level expert, and scholar with more than 10 years of experience in human rights, criminal and juvenile justice, and other spheres of law, including specific issues connected to matters of international security and counterterrorism. Her career has been dedicated to the protection of children and youth against serious forms of violence, including extrajudicial killings, unnecessary force, arbitrary arrest and detention, and exploitation by violent extremist groups, as well as to the planning and implementation of strategies fostering education, development, and proactive participation and representation in political processes. Since 2019, Cecilia Polizzi leads the CRTG Working Group, the only NGO worldwide with an exclusive focus to protect children from exploitation by violent extremist organizations. In this context, she oversees a range of programs to equip policymakers, professionals, and practitioners with the tools necessary to understand and respond to violence against children in this framework, and coordinate, among other activities, a portfolio identifying and addressing systemic issues driving youth involvement in violent extremism. Through her scholarship, Cecilia Polizzi dedicates continuous effort in supporting the application of the rule of law in counterterrorism policy and regulation, and particularly to the affordability of human rights and juvenile justice to children in this context. A globally recognized expert, her work was published in numerous academic journals and outlets, including UC Davis Journal of International Law and Policy, Homeland Security Today, the Greater Middle East, the Foreign Policy Project, and also supported the drafting of the 2020 Annual Report on Terrorism and Human Rights of the United Nations, High Commissioner for Human Rights. She contributes regularly as an expert commentator, speaker, and moderator, including in high-level United Nations panels, Congress, and international conferences. And she often advises and consults national governments, international, intergovernmental, and regional organizations, major groups, and other actors seeking to strengthen understanding, situational awareness, and operational capacity to address violent extremism and youth radicalization. Cecilia, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you to you, Eva, for the kind introduction and for the kind invite. I am truly delighted to be here with you today. I may start by sharing my screen. Terrorism has existed since before the dawn of recorded history, and there is little question that it continues to constitute, in the contemporary landscape, one of the most serious threats facing the international community. Among the critical trends that have affected and continue to reshape violent extremism in the past several years, the recruitment and use of children. And it perhaps would not be an exaggeration to state that this phenomenon represents a fast evolving component of terrorist tactics and strategy, imposing a clear and present danger to children, communities and societies, and international peace and security. The gravity of violence brought against children by terrorist actors imposes devastating consequences. It may result in early death or inflict extensive harm to the individual child, impairing personal, intellectual, and social development, and leaving survivors severely traumatized and having to endure the consequences of profound physical and emotional scars. Furthermore, the association of children with terrorist organizations entails stigmatization and the high risk of becoming victims of violence at the hand of law enforcement, military forces, and communities following apprehension, demobilization, and return. Ultimately, as part of the ongoing effort to understand the causes, the motivation, and factors driving the exploitation of children in terrorism, in the wake of severe acts of violence involving children, one crucial question commonly emerges. Why? Why children? Why to this extent? Why have children become a tool of Salafi-jihadism? And why are children perpetrating such heinous acts in support of terrorist violence? And why is this scary to us? In this lecture, we will therefore seek to find answers to some of these questions. We will provide an overview of the contemporary security landscape in which the exploitation of children in terrorism emerges, including major pre-existing enablers. We will explore the concept of child vulnerability as informed by neuroscientific theory and social constructions. We will identify child recruitment methods, both forced and driven by structural and individual factors. And we will ultimately discuss the expendability of children in the battlefield, tactical and military advantage. We will analyze symbolism and psychological responses to child involvement in extremist violence. And we will discuss the importance of children to the intergenerational perpetuation of Salafi-Jihadi ideology. We start here from the assumption that most international actors are rational. And while some terrorist acts are not goal-oriented, the recruitment and use of children is based upon rational choice, and it therefore remains open to rational analysis. The development of terrorism throughout the 20th and 21st century has been characterized by the increasing involvement of children. This is explained by the fact that terrorism evolves with consideration of the countermeasures applied against it. Terrorist organizations evolve continuously and dynamically, and the recruitment and use of children is part of the very same developmental trajectory. In the aftermath of September 11th, oppressive counterterrorism measures extensively lowered the probability of terrorist acts' operational success, and to avoid detection, terrorist groups became less hierarchical and more decentralized. The involvement of children in terrorism emerged, therefore, as a strategic change of tactics. In fact, equally to women, children are commonly associated with innocence and presumed to be inherently nonviolent. As one Taliban fighter stated during the rise in the Afghan civil war, children are innocent, so they are the best tools against dark forces. In addition, the malleability of children to indoctrination makes them particularly vulnerable targets who can be either coerced or induced by other means to involve in terrorist operations when the recruitment of adults does not seem to provide any comparative advantage and/or is simply lacking. The extensive, systematic, and protracted focus of terrorist organizations on children has led their exploitation to become an urgent transnational issue. And while the involvement of children in terrorism has primarily become a source of international outrage following its public display by the Islamic State propagandistic methods, this phenomenon is by no means unique to Syria and Iraq, but a terrorism and crime trend extending to all Salafi-Jihadist franchises in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, in Central Asia, in Southern East Asia, as well as a core overarching pattern in the rise of extremism. And it's worth here emphasizing that no child, regardless of its age, race, gender, nationality, or social status, is indemnified and/or protected against the risk of targeting by terrorist and violent extremist groups. In the contemporary security environment, however, both armed conflict and demography are to be considered as a series of pre-existing enablers to this phenomenon. Fragile and conflict-affected states are highly prone to terrorism. Internal struggles, protracted violence, and abysmal chaos debilitate governmental institutions, exacerbate pre-existing frailties, and create a power vacuum that violent extremist organizations exploit to establish safe havens, attract pools of recruits into the orbit of global jihad, and advance their agenda. And we may therefore state with confidence that children in armed conflict or children in geographical proximity to armed conflict present a higher degree of exposure to terrorist recruitment. The Office of the United Nations Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, mandated with the monitoring and reporting of the 6 grave violations against children, verified the highest number of cases of child recruitment in use in Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and the Syrian Arab Republic. The Office of the SRSG further documented the escalating nature of child recruitment in use, going in fact from 7,700 to 8,521 cases in the 2019 and 2020 period alone. The 90% of which, notably, at the end of non-state armed groups, including United Nations designated terrorist organizations. In addition to armed conflict, as we are now in the midst of the largest generation of human youth in history, demography constituted supplementary factors impacting the rate of child recruitment and use. And in 2005, almost the 50% of the population in developing countries was under 15 years of age, representing the 90% of the world youth. At present, also, in a country such as Somalia, children and youth continue to represent the 50.8% of the total population. And the same is notable in the Syrian Arab Republic, where prior to the outbreak of the civil war, the median age of the population was 24.4 years, with almost the 40% under 14 years of age. The simultaneous occurrence of these elements, therefore, of the armed conflict and terrorism nexus on one hand, and the child demographics on the other, leave these categories constituting a huge pool for exploitation into terrorist ranks, labor for the legal economy, and also contemporary forms of slavery, human trafficking, and other forms of organized crime. Children are considered among society's most vulnerable categories. In modern literature, the concept of child vulnerability is frequently associated with child development and is intended as the outcome of the interaction of a range of individual and environmental factors stemming from cognitive, emotional, and physical capabilities, but also socioeconomic status or responses to stressors, including exposure to violence. Neuroscience, psychosocial, and indeed all disciplines investigating brain function further inform our collective understanding regarding child vulnerabilities and developmental needs. The starting point is to recognize that children and young individuals have rudimentary skills of factual cognitions or mental processes such as learning, using and understanding language, memory, thinking and perception, but also moral cognition or cognitive ability, regulating impulse control. It is now therefore generally accepted that young children think about moral, social issue, and human relations in ways that are qualitatively different from the ways in which older children or adults may think. In general, the younger the child, the more barely developed will their cognitive, moral, and cognitive skills be. If we consider the full formation of psychological and cognitive capacity to be attained at 18 years of age, it is remarkable to notice how terrorist organizations neither set nor respect any minimum age for child targeting. We have seen a boy of 4 years of age appearing to detonate explosives in a car and killing 3 prisoners. We have assisted to mass abductions of boys and girls aged 7 years old. And we are also aware of the high number of children born into an armed conflict with an active terrorist organizations operating on the ground, or of those who brought their children to a country such as Syria or Iraq with the intent to join a terrorist organization. We can all imagine with what consequences. The notion of vulnerability is also an eclecticism apparent in a wide range of disciplines and forms part of key social constructions regarding childhood. Richard Mills, principal lecturer and head of the English department at West Hill in the United Kingdom, looks at the idea of child innocence found primarily in the New Testament of the Bible, where words such as best, fresh, and white denote a quality of purity and newness. A powerful endorsement is also found in the 18th century and 19th century writing, not least in Rousseau, who announces that the child exists within a state of nature. And given the absence of adverse circumstances, that would be in fact sufficient to develop what Postman calls the childhood virtues of, and I quote, spontaneity, purity, strength, and joy, all of which came to be seen as feature to nurture and celebrate. Mills continues that it is axiomatic that children are in need of physical protection and nurture for their well-being. And this is true as well for the young of any animal species. But he also affirms that children, by virtue of their childhood innocence, their promise of hope, their unalloyed vulnerability, represent somehow a force for good in the world and are therefore crucial for the survival of the species. And Mills ultimately also evaluate the concept of children as apprentices. Now, the term apprentice is an industrial concept stemming from the days when young people underwent a period of several years of transmission type learning, during which time they acquired the practical skills, or as a period of socialization. Anthropologists and sociologists have consistently shown that all societies develop systems by means of formal and or informal institutions for passing on appropriate knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and for the maintenance of acceptable patterns of behavior. The learner socialized is by no means a passive agent, but a sponge-like recipient. Terrorism ultimately arises from the condition of human existence. As we must consider terrorists as a type of human beings, despite of how inhumane we may perceive them, we must also assume that they share social constructs and perceptions of children as pure, innocent, as critical for the survival of the species, or as a sponge-like recipient. The targeting of children by terrorist actors therefore does not occur in spite of child vulnerability or in spite of a child's age, but precisely because of it. A child, as we have seen, does not have the physical or the cognitive capacity to defend itself from being recruited into a terrorist organization or lured into joining a terrorist organization. Different forms of coercion or influence are here associated with recruitment methods. Forced recruitment continues to remain prevalent, with terrorist groups frequently employing threats, including threats to family, relatives, elders, but also abductions or other forms of coercion. Since 2014, Boko Haram has employed mass kidnappings in Nigeria and the Lake Chad region. The infamous abduction of 276 schoolgirls in Chibok in April 2014, which spurred international outrage and the Bring Back Our Girls social media campaign, has been echoed by the abduction of 8 girls ranging from 8 to 15 years of age from a village in Nigeria, Borno State, by the abduction of 33 women and 6 children from the village of Gulewa, the Ifa region, and again by the abduction of 110 girls from a school in Dapchi in March 2018. Our data also shows that between 2014 and 2016, in a 2 years period, Boko Haram has abducted 10,000 boys for combat and military operations. In Somalia, incidents of forced recruitment by Al-Shabaab have been reported as early as 2009. The 30% of Al-Shabaab fighters were forcibly recruited, with most estimates following at the lower end at about 13%. However, Al-Shabaab use of forced recruitment, detention, intimidation, and abduction has as well shifted in recent years, becoming in fact more common since late 2017. And in 2020, Somalia had the highest number of forced or coerced children in armed groups globally. As ISIL occupied territories across Syria and Iraq, its members kidnapped thousands of children from orphanages, schools, and even their family homes. Children under the age of 14 reportedly made up over 1/3 of the 6,800 Yazidi that ISIL abducted in Sinjar. A further 800 to 900 children were reportedly kidnapped from Mosul for religious and military training. While recognizing that no child recruitment process can be regarded as truly voluntary, because of the developing cognitive abilities of the child and the different forms of coercion or exercise of influence or persuasion associated with recruitment methods, we may affirm that context and drivers, or otherwise defined the push and pull factors, explain a child voluntary involvement with a terrorist organization. At the outset, it is important to emphasize that none of the potential drivers used in relation to violent extremism or pathways used in the context of individual radicalization to violence should be considered in isolation, because we know in fact that a multitude of factors is generally involved. Furthermore, this potential pathway to violent extremism must also be contextualized with regard not only to local, but also national and international issues. With this in mind, there are two main categories of drivers. Push factors are intended as the conditions conducive to violent extremism and the structural context from which it emerges include the lack of socioeconomic opportunities, marginalization, discrimination, poor governance, human rights violation, prolonged conflict, unresolved conflict, but also radicalization in prison. And pull factors otherwise are intended as an individual motivation and processes which play a key role in transforming existing ideas and grievances into violent extremist action. And it includes, for instance, individual background and motivations, but also collective grievances and victimization stemming primarily from domination, oppression, subjugation, foreign intervention, but also misuse of beliefs, political ideologies, social networks, and others. Put more simply, push factors refer to those factors that are structural within society, while pull factors are psychological aspects that can render an individual more susceptible to undertaking violent extremist behavior or mature the desire to join a terrorist organization. Similarly to the child soldier phenomenon, in order to direct a human capital in the battlefield, terrorist organizations identify children as expendable resources. A series of factors are incidental to the targeting of children in this context, including, as it was mentioned previously, demography, leading to the ready availability of large cohorts of children in conflict and near conflict zones, the limited cognitive capacity of the child, enhancing disregard for risks and the prowess in engaging in dangerous operations, but also undetectability and or financial motives. And it is worth mentioning that the manner in which a child becomes involved with a terrorist organization, whether through forced means or voluntarily, does not determine the type of role or function played by the child in support of a specific terrorist organization. What remains, however, persistent is the causal link between the recruitment process and the subsequent forms of exploitation. Children represent an asset in support of the military pursuit of terrorist organizations or of a particular terrorist organization intra-group dynamics because they are inexpensive, versatile fighters, apt for deployment in a multitude of both combat and non-combat auxiliary roles. And as a consequence, the children are actively and systematically used in military operations as human shields, executioners, carriers of person-borne improvised explosive devices, as suicide bombers, or for the purposes of forced marriage, domestic servitude, sexual violence, and sexual exploitation. And while it would be presumable that all Salafi-jihadist terrorist organizations employ children the same way, the truth of the matter is that, notwithstanding the potential pledges of allegiance or the intent to promote mirroring ideology or strategy, not only a shared SOP regarding or standard operating procedure regarding child exploitation across groups is absent, but notable differences exist, and this being particularly evident regarding gender roles and gender considerations. However, the rationale driving the recruitment of children in terrorist organizations extends beyond the demography. It extends beyond the cognitive capacities, financial reasoning, or the exploitability in the battlefield to acquire a more subtle rationale and more subtle nuances. Now, let us look more specifically at the purposes of terrorist organizations and what terrorists want. Following Alex Schmid, the first objective of terrorism, on which everything depends, is the production of terror. Defined by Schmid as an extreme form of anxiety, followed by frightening imagery and intrusive and repetitive recollection. Causing and spreading terror is therefore at the forefront of any terrorist acts, and terrorist groups will typically strike out against targets that resonate with the target group that they wish to influence. In this respect, Gus Martin, in fact, argues that terrorists select their targets because of their symbolic and propaganda value. High-profile, sentimental, or otherwise significant targets are chosen with the expectation that the target's constituency will be moved, and then the victim audience will in some way suffer. The most relevant targets are those referring to the normative structures and relationships constituting the supportive frameworks of society. And now we have already had an opportunity to analyze the fundamental social constructions regarding children as related to attributes of innocence, vulnerability, goodness, apprenticeship, or socialization. And from here it derives not only the significance and the importance of the child within our society, but also, and most importantly, to the purposes of this lecture, the high symbolic value of their involvement with terrorist groups, as well as the impact of child imagery in terrorist propaganda. Faulkner, in fact, argues that there are a few issues in Western society that provoke outrage the same manner as that of the threat to childhood innocence. Following these considerations, and therefore it is not surprising that all Salafi-Jihadist organizations will display children and the mobilization of children in their propaganda campaigns. However, the transparency by which ISIL has done so remains at present unprecedented. The majority of media broadcasts feature the participation of children being normalized to violence, witnessing violence, training for violence, and perpetrating violence. Shocking depictions of child executioners, as the video of 5 prepubescent boys preparing to shoot Kurdish prisoners, children shooting dead 2 men presumed to be Russian spies, or the image of a 7-year-old Australian boy holding up a severed head, children appearing immune to brutality. Children are strategically chosen equally to other targets of terrorism to both destroy and create symbols. The display of children in propagandistic methods undermines and creates a disruption in the common perception regarding children as inherently non-violent, incapable of violence, or innocent, and it entails profound consequences. From a human rights perspective, children are targets, victims of abuse by terrorist actors. But for the witnessing audience, they are the means of terror. Children have become to symbolize terror. At present, there are more than 100, or better, 260 political or scholarly definitions of terrorism. And while there is no international consensus regarding what constitutes terrorism or how to universally define terrorism, the commonality is that contemporary terrorists and its agents are attributed a negative societal, notably political, connotation. A negative meaning that Lutz defined as pertaining to evil, indiscriminate violence, and brutality. The same connotation that is attributed to social groups, states, and individuals supporting terrorists now is attributed to children. And let us see to what effect. Now we have seen that the primary objective of terrorist organization is to spread terror. But what is terror? Terror is an emotion. And leaders within the global neo-jihadist movement recognize the importance of emotion. They want us to respond emotionally and irrationally to their violence. And they want us to do so in order to capitalize on those responses, intimidate us, and coerce us. And terrorism is therefore designed to inflict deep psychological wounds on an enemy rather than demolish its material ability to fight. And children are used in this sense to effect and trigger a psychological response on audiences. And it is so because the child, it is not solely inserted in a context of horrific violence, severed corpses, brutality, death, and destruction, but is also, more gravely, a proactive participant to it. It is a participant to a kind of violence that is profoundly characteristic of terrorism. The child is molded into it, and it is a cause to it. And therefore the child ceases in our minds to be considered as such and becomes something else, something foreigner, something alien, something or someone out of our control. Ultimately, we see the world through the prisms of identity. And the language here is that of absolutism with no room for ambiguity. It is enshrined in the rhetoric of us versus them, or good versus evil, in a dualism that has become so typical of the war on terror. It idealizes us and is founded on a negative projection onto them. In the dichotomy of us versus them, the child, in fact, ceases to be us, including aspects of our social constructs and acceptability, to become them. Another thing that terrorist wants is to survive. As the war against international terrorism has also been defined as the clash of civilization, or otherwise between the Islamic and Western worlds, contrasting values, cultures, religion, principles, wars in the fourth generation warfare become a war of ideas, and as such, the prevalent ideology must also survive. The tactical benefit in using children as an effective form of psychological warfare are therefore combined with a terrorist group's intention to prioritize them as a vehicle to propagate dogma through future generations. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Children exploited by terrorist actors are indoctrinated to an acutely severe and uncompromising adherence to Salafi-jihadism, which is founded on the premise that unbelievers should be persecuted. In a specific stipulation, all Muslim must associate exclusively with a fellow authentic Muslim and disassociate from anyone not fitting this constricted definition. Failure to rule in accordance with God's law constitutes unbelief, and opposing a terrorist organization is equivalent to apostasy. The adoption of militant methods of indoctrination integrates into an hybrid system ideological components and exposure to atrocity, and has both tactical and strategic value aimed to the institutionalization of the education system and youth groups. The prolonged exposure and participation of children in violent acts instills a deep ideological attachment to the creed of Salafi-jihadism, while desensitization to violence disseminates and nihilist disregard for human life and ensures the propagation of an utopian image of a sectarian Islam and its long-term survival. The systematic focus of terrorist organizations on child radicalization or indoctrination represents a prominent feature of purposes to self-perpetuation. It supports state-building goals or the ambition to create and impose new socio-political orders. By radicalizing children, terrorist groups ensure its longevity and alter social outcomes. Terrorism is a complex, man-made phenomenon with repercussions for every aspect of our society. Over the time, it has developed into a threat that knows no geographic or geopolitical boundaries. And the same is true for the exploitation of children in this context. In the course of this lecture, we have presented the recruitment and use of children in the contemporary security environment, identified armed conflict and demography as a series of enabling dimensions, and recognized that no child, regardless of its age, gender, status, or nationality, is protected and indemnified against terrorist targeting. We have analyzed the concept of child vulnerability as stemming from neuroscientific findings and social attribution, as well as its correlation to child recruitment. We have established that coercion remains the primary recruitment methods against other individual or structural components. And we have recognized the value of children towards the short and long-term purposes of terrorist organizations, including spreading terror, effective psychological responses, and ideological survival. Terrorism is often said the weapon of the weak. However, with regard to child recruitment in use, the weak becomes the weapon. Terrorist organizations make a long-term investment on children. They prey on the very innate characteristics of what makes a child a child. They prey on our most profound perceptions of the child and use it against us to spread fear and terror. From the rational analysis that we have drawn today, it is evident that there are various components driving child exploitation in terrorism. And while some are more evident than others, I hope that as a consequence of the time that we have spent together, we would be able to return to our lives understanding and remembering how truly intentional, purposeful, premeditated, and deliberate this all is. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that very, very powerful presentation. We do have some time for some questions and discussion. I will say that our speaker does have a hard stop right at noon, but that should give us still plenty of time. So please start thinking about your questions, and you can either type them in the chat. We can also use the hand raise feature. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask out loud to our speaker, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on those in the order that the hands come up there. But if we, for some reason, do not get to your question, we'll take them in the order that we receive them. But if we don't have time to get through all questions before noon, our speaker has graciously offered to share her email. So you can certainly ask her at another time and follow up the discussion via email. But I'll go ahead and stop there. So what questions do you have for our speaker?